Every year, more camera manufacturers are introducing their take on the modern camera meets retro design concept. As a whole, I couldn't be more pleased to see form and finish becoming a greater interest in photography, as it's always been my belief that cameras are more than a tool, often existing as a real source of inspiration. Classics of the past brought the art of photography to the consumer, not just by introducing portability, but by building a sense of style and form that encouraged a new relationship with the craft. The FM2A, the Olympus Pen F, the Leica M2, so many choices filled the streets, mountainsides, war zones, and places of worship that most future cameras became a near inevitability, inspired by those early forms. With time, though, the brutalist design of the 90s and early 2000s transformed our gear into something of a one-track tool, guided by utility and function. Mirrorless cameras are in many ways predisposed to a cold lifelessness, a set of components not dissimilar from our phones. Yet from 2012 on, Fujifilm made the bet that we would value a return to retro, that we'd value that original lore that cameras built in the 60s and 70s drew us into. And they were right. For the rest of this video, I'm going to explain why I think Fujifilm is, to this day, the king of retro, even with all of the new entrants coming into the space, competing for that crown. I have to preface with a couple of points before we get into this, and I hope this helps to put us on even ground. I'll be coming at this video with the comparative basis of the Fujifilm X-T5, as that's the camera I have the most experience with Fujifilm. So when you're thinking you want to talk to me about the GFX 100 or the XH series or the XS series, hold your tongue. It's just not the point of this video. Now, second, I want to get file quality as a concept out of the way before we even start. I can tell you right now that if you want to look at the data fidelity, the ability to push and pull the furthest, there's a better camera out there than the Fuji X-T5. In the retro space, the Nikon ZF, which we'll talk about later, is going to have a better file. And the argument for the Fujifilm X-T5 over the OM-3 from OM Systems, the same argument could be made. There's more pliability in the Fujifilm file, but I don't think there's a lot of value in trying to choose a winner based on the strength of their files. All of these cameras are wildly capable of creating the best art possible, and at this point, none of them are holding you back. And if you think they are, you're mistaken. Now, as I dig in, and as you either begin to build an agreement with me or an absolute disdainful hatred, hear me out. I'm going to alleviate some of that at the end of the video. Whether you hate me or love what I'm saying, stick around until the end and you'll begin to understand what I mean. Now, Fujifilm has always played a particularly important role in my photographic journey. Years ago, when I was starting in photography, I bought a camera, not a Fujifilm, and I nearly fell out of love with the concept of photography. I spent a year playing with this camera, growing and learning and shooting all the time, but all the while realizing I didn't like the process, and I didn't understand why, what was missing, what I was doing wrong. The photos were getting better, but I just was losing interest. Eventually, I sold that camera, and on a bit of a whim, I bought the Fujifilm X-T2. I had heard good things, seen good things, and decided to try those good things. So I bought it, I played with it, and something clicked right out of the gate. The design language is remarkable. It's well considered, it's beautiful, it pays homage to the filmic designs of the 60s and 70s, but it does something more. It builds an aggressive camera, a tactile camera that can be used in all different environments today. I've always fallen in love with the feeling that I can take my Fujifilm anywhere in the world, in any environment, and feel as though gloves on, snow in the air, sand in my eyes, I'll still be able to use the camera comfortably and make something beautiful. Now I know it's a bit of a cliche that those dials are tactile and that the camera is filmic, but the truth is there's something compelling about a design that embraces both minimalism, tactility, and intentionality above all else. The camera feels well considered, with things where they're supposed to be, but not too many of them. While it's not as customizable as some other cameras on the market, it doesn't need to be because the way it's designed functions effectively. So I've always loved that design language, and I've always loved how that design language encourages a kind of use case that I guess particularly suits the photography I've always loved: adventures, landscapes, and storytelling. Fujifilm does something remarkable with that, and where it earns its place as the retro king is by not being wasteful or inconsidered in any single element of its design. The design language is remarkably unchanged since that first X-T1, and aside from the X-T4 adding a flip screen for a moment, really what's made the camera great has made the camera great from the very first iteration to the most recent one. A design that works, that functions, that draws you into adventure, rather than getting in between you, that adventure, and the stories you're trying to tell. As I see it, there are two primary competitors to the X-T5 in terms of the reign for Retro King. First is going to be the Nikon ZF, and I think the main argument for this camera really boils down to the sensor. Having full frame is invaluable, and that dynamic range, that low light capability, it's something that if you absolutely need it, it's the only option in this space. But like I argued earlier, I think that this doesn't necessarily give it the crown. These files are more impressive than the X-T5s in terms of their pliability, but that doesn't mean they necessarily look better. The X-T5 has a beautiful grain structure that makes the low light photos look gorgeous, even in high ISO. It's often something you can lean into, introducing that grain as a creative effect, and with modern technology, if you want, you can get rid of it. Then there's, again, this concept of tactility. The Nikon does a great job with dials, and I absolutely wish the brass would get brought over to the Fujifilm system. The material feeling of the Nikon is something to really savor. But the usability is, in my experience, not so good. The physical design of the camera is just something I couldn't get my head around. While it may pay homage to the flat profiles of old film cameras, the amount going on inside the camera, combined with the increased weight and the big full-frame lenses, mean that a gripless camera like this really sits uncomfortably in the hand. Now, the OM-3 pulls off a similar design, and I'm going to get to that in a minute about why I think it works for them and not so much for the Nikon. Once you get the Nikon in hand, while you've got that tactility, you have a near inability to use it with one hand. And quite frankly, it becomes extremely uncomfortable to hold on to for long periods of time. Take the fact that there's no joystick as well, and a PASM dial on the left that begins to get rid of that filmic heritage, and all of a sudden I think it's caught between two worlds. It's caught between a true retro design and a modern one. It's caught between being a well thought out tactility and a poor camera to actually handle. And while it's gorgeous and while the materials are compelling, the actual final package to me just doesn't feel very good in the hand. And for that reason, it just can't be the king of retro. It's a great first step, but I think Nikon has steps to take before it can really be the most compelling option. Up until 1 or 2 weeks ago, I would have said that there are only really two horses in the race, the Nikon ZF and the Fujifilm X-T5, gunning for the title of King of Retro Cameras. But there is a third and really a fourth. Now, the third is the Leica ecosystem, but I largely want to leave them out of this because of cost, quality, just a whole different philosophy. The history of Leica transcends so much of what these other brands are doing at this time, and quite frankly, the comparison feels a bit useless. Most people shopping for a Fuji will not necessarily be comparing it to a Leica, and if they are, they're kind of missing the point. But the other player in this race is the OM Systems OM-3, just introduced recently. I haven't used the camera, so what I'm saying is based off of what I've heard from God knows how many different reviews and just people speaking to the quality of the camera. It's beautiful, it's aesthetically driven, it's based on the model of the OM-1, which was a gorgeous film camera with hints of the Pen F built in as well. But ultimately, there are two reasons I can't really consider this the retro king. First, that design feels marred with contradictions. It's beautiful in its aluminum design. It has this very retro aesthetic. It has dials, it has switches, all good, right? Well, what do those dials and switches do? They're PASM dials. They're looks that are a lot like a Lightroom preset built into a JPEG file. Ultimately, they are things that make it distinctly not very retro. And then there's the back of the camera. The mixing of leather and plastic, the introduction of an articulating screen next to a weird pronounced grip, all of it feels a little bit inconsidered and really unserious in a way. It's beautiful, it's so close, but it's just not there for me. Now the second and really the bigger reason it can't be the retro king is really the longevity of progression. Fujifilm operates under this philosophy of Kaizen, and really the idea is to update continuously, keep cameras modern, and introduce new upgrades as things go. Now, do they introduce wild, new, crazy features and AI concepts and so forth in each new camera? Well, no, they don't, but they keep their cameras relevant for years after they're released. Fujifilm cameras are taken care of, and before you start blasting me in the comments, yes, they released an update that jeopardized the autofocus on the X-T5, and yes, it has been fixed. Was that a mistake? Sure, but after almost a decade and a half of this philosophy being successfully implemented, I think judging them based off of a bad firmware update one time is a bit ridiculous. Now, I believe OM Systems has some great technology in their camera, but ultimately it's nothing that wasn't introduced 5 years ago for the most part. They haven't done hardly anything to modernize or to update since they released some pretty cool tech half a decade ago. Now, part of this is that Olympus died and OM Systems was reborn from the ashes, and they're clamoring to pick up whatever pieces remain to turn into new cameras, but they need to start upgrading in order to really inspire confidence in the future of their cameras. Quite frankly, depreciation speaks to the viability of a camera in the future, and when you look at the Nikon versus the OM Systems cameras versus the Fujifilm cameras, Fujifilm holds its value far longer than any of them. Even next to Leica, Fujifilm does an exceptional job of holding value, depreciating far less than most of these brands. So when it all boils down, I think the Fujifilm is a more compelling option right now, both in terms of design and function next to the OM-3, but also and especially going into the future. Now, I'm sure by this point you have noticed that I'm not talking about perhaps the most filmic element of Fujifilm, which is their film simulations. And for some people, this would be the most discerning variable. This would be the thing that makes them rise to the top the fastest. But for me, it just doesn't play a part in my decision as to whether they're the retro king or not, because I, quite frankly, just don't ever use it. I shoot in RAW, and so therefore those profiles are never embedded into the files that I work with. I will say there are times where I like to add Asyasof or monochromatic filter, because that allows me to see how something will start to end up at the end, and sometimes it makes the shooting process just that bit more fun. But quite frankly, I very rarely use film profiles, and so they're just not included in this evaluation. And so, all things considered, I believe there are 3 runners in this race: the OM-3 from OM Systems, the Nikon ZF, and the Fujifilm X-T5. After everything's been considered, one word probably summarizes this best, and that's just intentionality. I think the Fujifilm X-T5 is more well considered. It was built with such good foundations that not much has changed or had to change for it to be the premium offering in this specific sector. And I still feel, even with the innate value of a full frame sensor, and even with the amazing computational capabilities of the OM-3, that the Fujifilm X-T5 strikes this balance and this performance that none of the others quite hit. It handles the best, it feels the best, it's built the best, and it functions exactly how I want it to, all the while encouraging a kind of photography, adventure, and pursuit of storytelling that none of the others, I believe, do well enough in general to warrant that space as the retro king. Now it's time for the caveat. It's time for what I introduced at the start of this video, the wrench that could be thrown into all of this. I could have made this video and called the OM-3 the king. I could have called the Nikon ZF the king, and there's a really good argument for each one of them. And in fact, I'd love to make a video arguing why each one of them is the king. I don't have enough experience with the other two to make that video, and I do at this time genuinely believe that the X-T5 is the king of retro cameras. But I want you to recognize that there's so much relative value. There's so much bond between us and our cameras that I have a lot of bias. I'm operating with these opinions because I believe that the X-T5, out of every moment I've spent with it, stands out. But other people just won't feel the same way, so you need to take what I say with a grain of salt. And if you just absolutely hate me for this because you think the OM-3 or the Nikon ZF is the better camera based on your experience, well then great, it's the better camera based on your experience. I'll leave you with that, and that's a fair stance to take. Anyway, thank you guys for watching, and I'll talk to you again soon. Have a good one.